Have you ever trusted someone completely, a friend, a mentor, a spiritual guide, and then watched them turn that trust into a weapon? Have you ever felt the exact moment when the person who was supposed to protect you became the very source of your wound? And have you ever wondered if those scars, the ones that live inside the chest long after the bruises are gone, if those scars ever fully heal? Saint Teresa of Avila lived that question, not as a thought experiment, not as a theological exercise written from a safe distance. She lived it in her body, in her convent walls, in her prayer life, and in the deepest chambers of her soul. She was born in Avila, Spain, on the 28th of March, 1515. She entered the Carmelite monastery of the Incarnation at the age of 20. By the time she was in her 40s, she had already spent 2 decades navigating a spiritual life that was half fire and half confusion. And the confusion, she would later admit, was not an accident. It had a face, it had a name, and it had trusted official, church-sanctioned access to the most vulnerable parts of her interior world. Teresa was one of the most gifted mystics in the history of the Western Church. She received visions. She experienced what she described as raptures, moments where her body would rise from the ground while she was in prayer, so uncontrollable that she would grab onto the convent railings and beg God to stop because the experience was too overwhelming and too public for a woman who did not want to draw attention to herself. She wrote about an angel piercing her heart with a flaming gold lance, a vision so vivid and so physical that she describes the heat spreading from her pierced heart into her limbs. That vision would later be immortalized in marble by Gian Lorenzo Bernini in Rome in 1652. These were not the experiences of a fragile or easily suggestible woman. Teresa was sharp, strategic, funny, and deeply stubborn. She founded 17 Carmelite convents across Spain under conditions that would have broken most people. She argued with bishops. She challenged inquisitors. She reformed a religious order from the inside, while battling chronic illness that had paralyzed her for nearly 3 years in her 20s, institutional hostility from within her own order, and the kind of interior suffering that cannot be named in polite company. And yet, for years, the deepest betrayal in her life came wrapped in the robes of a confessor. If you value documented history like this, rooted in primary sources and lived testimony, subscribe. It is the best way to support our work. And drop a comment letting us know what city you are watching from. This script draws primarily from Teresa's own autobiography, the Libro de la Vida, written around 1562 under obedience to her confessor at the time, which Teresa herself described as an attempt to give a true account of her soul's experiences to those responsible for guiding her. The second major source is Rowan Williams's 2011 study Teresa of Avila, which is not a devotional biography, but a rigorous theological and psychological analysis of how Teresa's experiences of darkness and betrayal actually shaped the intellectual architecture of her mature writing. Williams is not a hagiographer. He is a former Archbishop of Canterbury and a trained theologian who approaches Teresa the way you would approach a case study in the intersection of power, interior life, and survival. The difference between his reading and the typical devotional account is the difference between an X-ray and a portrait. Both are real. Only one shows you what is underneath. Now back to the information. The man who shattered the most critical years of Teresa's interior development was not a villain in the obvious sense. He was a local priest, deeply devout by local reputation, theologically trained and, crucially, inexperienced with the kind of mystical states Teresa was experiencing. His name was not widely recorded in the way her later confessors were, but Teresa documents his influence in the Libro de la Vida with painful and precise clarity. She describes going to him in her late 30s, already tormented by the question of whether her visions were from God or from the devil. This was not a small or abstract question. In 16th century Spain, a woman claiming mystical experiences had 2 possible fates. She could be recognized as holy and her experiences validated, which would open doors of spiritual authority and influence. Or she could be handed to the Inquisition as a potential case of diabolical deception or spiritual pride, which could end her life or her freedom. The margin between those 2 outcomes was determined almost entirely by the judgment of whoever was hearing her confession and providing spiritual direction. She had no recourse outside that judgment. There was no appeals process. There was no other system. This confessor heard her describe her raptures, her interior voices, her visions of Christ's humanity moving inside her prayer, and he told her they were from the devil, not once, repeatedly, over years. He instructed her to make a particular gesture whenever a vision appeared, a gesture of rejection and contempt, a physical waving away, as if the vision were a temptation to be resisted rather than a grace to be received. He told her to resist the interior states she was entering. He told her the peace she felt in contemplative prayer was dangerous. He told her that what she was experiencing was spiritual pride dressed in the clothing of grace, that her soul was not as advanced as she imagined, that her interior experiences were evidence of self-deception rather than divine favor. And he said all of this from a position of official ecclesiastical authority. This was not a stranger's opinion. This was the verdict of her confessor, the person who, under the theology and practice of the time, held the keys to her sacramental life and her spiritual guidance. Teresa obeyed. She had been formed by a culture and a church that taught women to submit their interior lives to male clerical authority without question. She obeyed, even when everything inside her resisted with enormous force. She obeyed, even when the peace and the light she experienced in those moments of prayer felt more real than anything she had ever touched in the external world. She described the experience in the Libro de la Vida as living under two skies at once, one where she could see the sun clearly, and one where a voice, invested with institutional power, kept insisting that the sun was not real. She said this period lasted for nearly 2 years. 2 years of being told by the person God had given her to trust that God was not where she most deeply felt God to be. The damage was not abstract. Teresa documents it in physiological and psychological terms that are remarkably precise for the 16th century. She experienced what we would now recognize as symptoms of chronic psychological distress, compounded by spiritual confusion, persistent exhaustion, an inability to enter prayer, physical trembling before going to confession, a creeping dread of the interior silence that had previously been the source of all her peace and strength. She describes being afraid to be alone with her own soul. Let that sentence land for a moment. A woman whose entire spiritual life had been built on interiority, on the discipline of turning inward, of finding God in the silence beneath the surface noise, was afraid of her own interior. She did not stop believing in God. She never doubted God's existence or goodness. But the access point to God, the quiet, contemplative, interior life she had built over 20 years of practice and discipline, had been systematically poisoned by a trusted voice telling her it was unsafe to go in there. Cold, still, collapsed. This is what a deep betrayal by a confessor actually looks like in a 16th century Spanish convent. It does not look like violence. It does not announce itself with a dramatic rupture. It looks like slow erosion over months and years. It looks like a woman kneeling at the confessional rail and offering the most vulnerable truth she has ever said out loud, and watching the person across from her use that truth to confirm her worst fears about herself. It looks like obedience. It looks, from the outside, like humility. Teresa eventually left that confessor. The Libro de la Vida documents the turning point with characteristic precision. She met a Jesuit priest named Father Juan de Pradanos in 1557, who listened to her descriptions of her interior prayer experiences and told her, without hesitation, that what she was describing sounded like the authentic work of the Holy Spirit. 1557. After at least 2 years of being told the opposite by someone with authority over her soul, she describes the relief as physical, as though something that had been pressing against her sternum from the inside, like a stone she had been carrying without knowing it, finally gave way all at once. Father Juan de Pradanos would die young within a few years of their first meetings, but his intervention changed the entire trajectory of Teresa's interior life. He is one of the men who gave Teresa back her own experience. He gave her back the right to trust what she had seen and felt. But here is where Teresa's story moves from personal survival into something more theologically terrifying and pastorally important. Teresa did not simply recover, she went deeper. And in going deeper, she began to understand something about the scars that betrayal leaves behind, not as a psychological observer from the outside, but as someone mapping the interior damage from within, with the precision of an explorer who has walked every inch of damaged ground. These are not metaphorical scars in Teresa's account. They are structural. They change the architecture of the soul's interior movement. In The Interior Castle, written in 1577, 15 years after the Libro de la Vida, Teresa describes the soul as a castle made of diamond or very clear crystal, with many rooms arranged concentrically from the outermost chambers where the soul is most distant from its center, to the innermost room where God dwells in permanent intimacy with the soul's deepest self. The enemy, the demonic, the distorting, the corrupting, does not attack the innermost room directly. The enemy cannot reach there. Instead, it attacks from the threshold. It attacks by making the soul afraid to move inward. It attacks by making the very act of entering feel dangerous. This is not abstract theology. This is experiential cartography. Teresa knew what it felt like to be prevented from moving inward by a trusted authority. She had lived it for 2 years. And in The Interior Castle, she encodes that knowledge as warning and as map, not for mystics in the abstract, not for religious virtuosos who have never tasted suffering, but for any human being whose interior access to their own deepest truth has been blocked by another person's fear, misunderstanding, or abuse of spiritual power. She writes in the third dwelling place of The Interior Castle about souls who are good, who are devout, who are genuinely trying with everything they have, and who are nonetheless paralyzed at the threshold. They cannot seem to advance. They pray, they keep the disciplines, they do not commit serious sin, and yet there is a kind of ceiling they cannot penetrate, a barrier they cannot name. she describes them with enormous and careful tenderness. They are not wicked, they have not failed. But they are afraid of moving into the deeper silence. They are afraid of the interior itself. And she says with clarity that this fear is the enemy's greatest weapon. Not because the enemy can take God away, but because the enemy can make the soul afraid to go toward God. The castle exists, the innermost room exists, but if the soul is too afraid to walk through the rooms, the castle might as well not be there. Teresa knew what built that fear. She had a name for it. It was not weakness of character, it was wound. By 1562, when Teresa founded the first Reformed Carmelite convent, San Jose in Avila, with 13 women, she was not just a mystic building a monastery. She was a woman who had survived institutional spiritual betrayal and was constructing a physical space where that particular betrayal would be systematically harder to repeat. The Reformed Carmelite life she designed was built around small communities of no more than 13 women. The smallness was absolutely deliberate. In large communities like the Monastery of the Incarnation, which housed over 150 women when Teresa lived there, accountability was diffuse to the point of being non-existent. No one could track what any single confessor was doing to any single soul over time. In a community of 13, with rotating confessors and direct access to the prioress, that diffusion was structurally impossible. She designed a system where no single spiritual director had unchecked and unmonitored access to the interior lives of the sisters over a prolonged period of time. She also wrote into the founding documents of her Reformed convents specific protections around the choice of confessors. The sisters were not to be compelled to go to a confessor they found harmful. They were to have recourse. She did not frame this in the language we would use today. She framed it in the language of practical wisdom about the soul's fragility and the particular danger of poor spiritual direction. But the structural intent is not hard to read. She was engineering a community in which the specific damage done to her would be harder to inflict on others. No one named this at the time as institutional safeguarding. No historian writing in the 16th century identified it as a response to clerical abuse of spiritual authority. But that is precisely what it was. Teresa of Avila designed safer structures because she had lived inside an unsafe one, and she knew exactly which structural features had made the damage possible. What does a deep betrayal leave behind? Teresa's answer, distributed across the Libro de la Vida, the Interior Castle, and the Way of Perfection, finished around 1566, is threefold and completely concrete. First, it leaves a learned flinching. The soul that has been told by someone with authority that its most authentic experience is dangerous learns to distrust its own perception at the deepest level. This is not a failure of faith. This is a survival adaptation. Teresa describes it in the Interior Castle as a narrowing, the soul pulling in its antennae, reducing the surface area of its exposure, contracting around the wound. She does not moralize about this narrowing. She describes it the way a careful physician describes inflammation following injury, as the body's response to harm, rational given what happened, not a character flaw requiring correction through willpower. The flinching shows up in specific interior behaviors. The soul that has been wounded in this way approaches prayer differently. It approaches silence differently. Even after the source of the danger is gone, even after years have passed, there is a residual hesitation at the door of the interior, a pause that was not there before the wound, a small contraction at the threshold. Teresa knows this from the inside. She knows the pause. She had it for years, even after Pradanos had reassured her. Even after the Interior Castle was complete and her mystical authority was recognized across Spain, she wrote to her sisters about the tendency of the soul to retreat from depth under pressure. She had watched it in herself. She never pretended it was fully gone. Second, it leaves a distorted image of the guide as category. Teresa is extremely precise here, and this is the part that most pastoral literature skips entirely because it is so uncomfortable. She says one of the long consequences of bad spiritual direction is that the soul begins to generalize. It does not only distrust the specific person who caused harm, it begins to distrust the entire category of guide, the entire institution of spiritual direction. It becomes afraid of spiritual accompaniment as such, not because it is irrational, but because it has learned from documented experience that the person holding the map can lead you off a cliff while insisting they are pointing to the summit. She writes in The Way of Perfection that finding a genuinely learned and good confessor is almost as important as finding God, because without trustworthy accompaniment, the soul is left to navigate alone the very terrain that most requires a guide. The cruelest irony is that the soul most in need of a guide is precisely the soul most afraid to trust one, because it has already paid the full cost of trusting the wrong one. Third, it leaves what Teresa calls a residual smallness. This is perhaps the most subtle consequence, and it is also the most lasting. She describes souls who have experienced betrayal in their interior life as having a persistent tendency to think less of their own experience than it actually deserves, to preemptively diminish what they have seen, heard, and felt in the interior, before anyone else can do it for them. Not humility, diminishment. Teresa draws the distinction precisely and repeatedly. Humility, in her theology, is truth, seeing yourself and your experience with clarity and accuracy, neither inflating nor deflating. Diminishment is the opposite of truth. It is the internalized voice of the person who told you that what you saw was not real, that what you felt was not trustworthy, that what you heard in the silence was probably from the devil and not from God. The residual smallness shows up in very specific behaviors that Teresa documents with the precision of someone who has watched them in herself and in the sisters she directed over 30 years. It shows up as the inability to ask for what you genuinely need from a guide without apologizing for the request, as chronic overqualification of your own interior experience, as the habit of framing your most authentic perceptions as probably mistaken before anyone else can make that judgment, as the instinct to shrink the account of your own interior life before you offer it, because you remember, at a level below conscious thought, what happened the last time you offered it fully and without protection. Teresa calls this wound curable, but she does not call it quick. And she absolutely does not romanticize the cure or dress it in the language of triumph. If you're still with this, if something in what Teresa describes is landing close to home, subscribe and comment from your city. We research these stories all the way down to the ground. This script draws on the Libro de la Vida in its critical scholarly edition, as well as Williams' 2011 study, which reconstructs Teresa's psychological and theological development with more precision than any devotional source will give you. Williams' chapter on Teresa's confessors, specifically his analysis of the 2-year crisis in the late 1550s, is the most clear-eyed account of what was actually done to her and what it cost. Most people reading about Teresa's life will never encounter that chapter, because it requires reading her not as a saint to be emulated, but as a human being who was harmed and who survived it. Now, back to the story. What Teresa says, and this is the part that is almost never quoted in spiritual direction manuals or retreat guides, is that the primary agent of recovery from this particular wound is not another confessor. It is not another authority figure, however benevolent, replacing the damaging one. It is God working directly in the soul through what she calls the prayer of quiet. The prayer of quiet is a specific and identifiable stage in her map of contemplative experience, described in detail in both the Libro de la Vida and the Interior Castle. It is characterized by a kind of interior stillness that does not depend on verbal prayer, on structured reasoning, or on the mediation of any human figure whatsoever. The soul rests, it is held. Nothing is required of it except to not flee from the holding. The will becomes quiet. The intellect becomes quiet. Something remains, something that receives without generating. And in that receiving, the soul begins to relearn that the interior is not dangerous, not by being told, not by being reassured through someone else's words, but by the accumulated evidence of repeated interior experience in which the silence does not wound. Teresa's argument, and it is a sustained and carefully constructed argument, not a devotional suggestion, is that the soul damaged by betrayal must relearn from direct experience that God is safe to approach. The relearning cannot happen through doctrine. It cannot happen through another human authority, however good, simply telling the soul that the interior is safe now. It must happen in the interior itself. It must be discovered in the place where it was lost. This is both her most hopeful claim and her most demanding one, because it means there is no shortcut. There is no substitute for going back in. The only way to know the interior is safe is to keep returning to it, slowly, without forcing, without demanding results, until the safety becomes something the soul knows for itself, rather than accepts on someone else's authority. This is radical in a way that is hard to overstate. In 16th century Catholic Spain, where a woman's spiritual life was almost entirely mediated by male clerical authority, Teresa of Avila is saying that there is a level of the soul's interior relationship with God that no confessor can touch, a place where the damage of bad spiritual direction cannot ultimately reach, and a place where healing must ultimately originate. She had to say it carefully. The Inquisition was not theoretical. The consequences of saying it too plainly were real and immediate. But she said it, encoded in the language of mystical theology, distributed across her writings over 3 decades, legible to any reader who has also been locked out of their own interior by a trusted authority. The Libro de la Vida was seized by the Inquisition in 1575. Princess Juana, daughter of Charles V, had a copy, and the Inquisition confiscated it. Teresa spent years trying to ensure that the record of her experience, including the implicit record of what had been done to her, was not simply erased by the institution that had enabled the damage in the first place. She wrote to the Grand Inquisitor himself. She requested that the text be evaluated, not suppressed. She was 60 years old and seriously ill, and she was still fighting for the right of her account to exist. The text was eventually returned, evaluated, and declared orthodox. But the impulse behind the seizure, the desire to silence a woman's detailed account of her own interior life, especially an account that implicitly indicted the judgment of male confessors. That impulse is not hard to read at this distance. The permanent scar. That phrase deserves a direct reckoning with what Teresa actually claimed about what betrayal leaves that does not go away. She did not claim that betrayal leaves no permanent mark. The interior castle is too honest, too precise, too experiential for that kind of reassuring resolution. She describes the soul's progress as perpetually uneven, marked by genuine advances and by sudden retreats, by collapses back into fear even after years of stable and fruitful interior life. She acknowledges that souls who have been deeply wounded in their spiritual development carry a susceptibility that never fully disappears, a tendency to interpret new experiences of interior intimacy through the filter of the old damage. The new voice can be heard through the old suspicion. The new opening can be approached with the old contraction. That does not make the soul trapped, but it means the soul is not the same shape it would have been without the wound. Teresa knew that. She did not pretend otherwise. But she also says something that is very easy to miss if you are reading quickly, looking for consolation. She says the scar itself can become a particular site of grace, not because suffering is intrinsically good, not because the wound was necessary or deserved or part of a plan that required it, but because the terrain the soul has had to traverse to reach a certain depth of interior life, the terrain of distrust, of fear, of the slow and painstaking rebuilding of the capacity to receive, that terrain teaches things that cannot be taught any other way. They cannot be read about. They cannot be acquired through spiritual discipline from a place of safety. They are only available to a soul that has walked that ground from the inside. She describes this in the interior castle with the dry precision of a woman who has earned every word. She says souls that have come through this particular suffering have a quality of compassion that is structurally unavailable to souls whose interior life has been serene. They know what the outer rooms feel like when you're afraid to go further in. They know the texture of that fear because they lived it. And that knowing makes them uniquely capable of meeting other wounded souls in those outer rooms without judgment, without impatience, without the spiritual condescension that mistakes one's own clarity for virtue. This is not consolation. This is anthropology. Teresa is identifying a specific kind of human being forged by a specific kind of experience and describing with precision what that forging produces. She built her convents with this knowledge operating. The sisters she chose for leadership were not always the most naturally serene or spiritually advanced in the conventional sense. Several of the prioresses she appointed and trusted most deeply were women who had come through significant interior darkness and disorientation. Maria de San Jose, one of Teresa's closest collaborators and eventually a gifted prioress in Seville, had a complex and often turbulent interior life that Teresa knew intimately. Teresa wrote to Maria with a directness she reserved specifically for people she respected completely, people whose suffering she regarded not as spiritual deficiency, but as a form of knowledge that made them more useful in the service of others, not less. Teresa died on the 4th of October, 1582, in Alba de Tormes, Spain. She was 67 years old. She had been traveling despite serious illness, hemorrhaging and febrile, and she collapsed before she could reach her home convent of San Jose in Avila. Her last recorded words, spoken to Anne of St. Bartholomew, who held her through her final hours, were words of gratitude to God for having made her a daughter of the Church. Not triumph, not resolution. Gratitude and identification with the community that had simultaneously wounded her and been her home. She was canonized in 1622 by Pope Gregory XV. In 1670, Pope Clement X declared her a doctor of the Church, the first woman in history to receive that title. The formal declaration cited her exceptional quality of practical and experiential teaching about the interior life. Practical? Experiential. The Vatican was, perhaps without fully intending to, acknowledging that the authority of her teaching came from the ground of her experience, including the ground of having been denied access to her own experience by a confessor who did not understand what he was hearing. The betrayal that wounded Teresa deepest was also the experience that most directly shaped the pastoral intelligence of her mature writing. The theology of the interior castle is not the theology of someone who navigated the interior life smoothly, from grace to greater grace, without detour. It is the theology of someone who was denied access to her own interior by a trusted authority for years, who found her way back in at enormous cost, and who then spent the remaining decades of her life mapping every room in the castle with the particular attention and fury of someone who knows exactly what it costs to be locked out. The castle metaphor itself carries the memory of the wound. In the first dwelling place, Teresa says one of the primary dangers is that the soul does not even know it has an interior. It lives entirely on the surface, driven by noise and the demands of others, and it never occurs to it that there is a castle at all. She links this to two causes, sin and pats, and here she is specific and quiet and precise, the influence of those around the soul who discouraged from entering by those around it. Teresa of Avila wrote those words in 1577, 20 years after Father Juan de Perdanos told her that her interior life was from God and not from the devil. 20 years. And the first dwelling place of the interior castle is still, in its deepest structure, a document about what happens to a human soul when someone with authority over its spiritual life tells it not to go in. Among the papers found in her cell after her death was a small folded note in her own handwriting. No addressee, no date. A single line from the book of Job in Latin. Domine, si aduc necessarius sum populo tuo, non recuso laborum. Lord, if I am still necessary to your people, I do not refuse the labor. No one knows when she wrote it. No one knows how long she had kept it near her. It was a private document, not written for posterity. Just a line she had held on to across decades of founding, reforming, fighting, suffering, and writing. A line about willingness to remain in difficulty and continue the work, not because the difficulty had ended, but because the labor had not yet been completed. The scar was permanent. The castle was still being built, and she did not refuse the labor. That is the line the wound eventually produced. That is what a deep betrayal leaves in a soul that does not collapse under it. Not peace, not the absence of the mark, but a willingness so quiet it fits on a folded scrap of paper found in a dead woman's cell. The scar is still visible in the architecture of the castle. That is the truest thing she ever wrote. But there is one more layer to this story that most accounts of Teresa's life quietly omit, and it is perhaps the most important one for anyone who has ever experienced the particular pain of being wounded by someone they trusted with their spiritual or interior life. Teresa, in the final decade of her life, so between 1572 and 1582, began writing letters to her sisters about what she called the danger of spiritual friendship that turns possessive. She had seen it happen in her own communities. A prioress becomes intensely close to one sister. The confessor develops a special relationship with one penitent. The guide begins to need the guided in ways the guided cannot name but can feel. And the need, unexamined, curdles. It does not always look like harm. Sometimes it looks like extraordinary attention. Sometimes it looks like being chosen, singled out, seen. Teresa knew what it looked like from both sides, because she had experienced both sides. She had been the woman who was singled out by a confessor, who then used that singling out as a form of control. She had also watched, from the position of prioress, how easily a close spiritual friendship could shade into a dynamic where the more powerful person's needs were being met in ways that slowly hollowed out the less powerful person's interior life. She wrote about this to Maria de San Jose in 1576 with characteristic bluntness. The letter is preserved. She says, in effect, that when a sister seems to be improving rapidly under an unusually close spiritual relationship, the prioress should watch with two eyes, one for the genuine signs of grace, and one for the signs that the sister's growth is in fact growing dependency on the human guide rather than on God, because the two can look identical from the outside for years. And when the dependency is the true engine of the apparent growth, the collapse, when it comes, is total. The soul that was growing toward the guide and not toward God finds itself, when the guide is removed or revealed as flawed, not simply disappointed, but structurally emptied. It does not know who it was outside the relationship. Its entire interior architecture was built around a person, not around the center of the castle. Teresa calls this one of the most serious wounds a soul can sustain, specifically because it often begins in what looks like grace. The confessor who damages a soul through false mystical guidance is dangerous, but the confessor who damages a soul through excessive intimacy that creates structural dependency. The confessor may be even more dangerous because the soul that has been spiritually possessed by a guide does not know it has been wounded. It knows only that when the guide is gone or unavailable, the world empties out, and it interprets that emptiness not as evidence of a wound, but as longing for God. The wound wears the disguise of the very thing it has displaced. Teresa had seen this. She may have felt the edge of it herself at certain points in her own history of relationships with confessors. The Libro de la Vida is careful around this topic in the way that 16th century Spanish decorum required. But the letters are less careful. And the letters, read alongside the interior castle's insistence that the soul's deepest relationship is always and only with God, suggest that Teresa understood this danger from the inside as well as from the outside. What she recommends, with a practicality that runs through everything she ever wrote, is not the avoidance of spiritual friendship or close guidance. She's not asking for distance or formality. She's asking for what she calls spiritual freedom. The soul that is genuinely free in God can love its confessor deeply, trust its guide profoundly, and still return every night to the innermost room where only God lives. The soul that lacks that freedom, for whatever reason, whether wound or dependency or unexamined longing, is a soul that has, without knowing it, handed the keys of the castle to a human figure and hoped that human figure will not lose them or misuse them. Teresa's entire mature theology is an argument against that hope. Not against the love, against the architectural mistake of putting a human being where only God fits. The interior castle ends, famously in the seventh dwelling place, where Teresa describes the spiritual marriage, the soul's deepest and most permanent union with God. She describes it not as a state of perpetual ecstasy or sensory experience, but as a settled, quiet, completely stable knowledge that God is present at the center. The raptures and visions and spiritual consolations of the earlier stages largely cease. What remains is what cannot be taken away. Not feeling, not experience in the sensory or emotional sense, something more like knowing, a certainty that does not require continuous verification, a presence that does not depend on any human mediator remaining available, trustworthy, or even alive. This is the place Teresa spent 30 years trying to reach and describe. And it is the place that can only be reached, she insists, by a soul that has learned not to locate its center in any figure outside itself, which means, in practice, that the souls most likely to reach the seventh dwelling place are often the souls that have been most thoroughly stripped of the illusion that another human being can carry them there. The wounds that stripped them of that illusion were real wounds. They caused real damage. They left real scars. But the stripping itself, the terrible education of betrayal, produced a kind of interior clarity about where the center actually is that no amount of smooth and uncomplicated spiritual progress would have generated. This is not a comfortable theology. Teresa does not offer it as comfort. She offers it as cartography. The map is what it is. The terrain is what it is. She walked it. She wrote it down. She built communities designed to make it a little safer for others to walk it after her. She was 67 years old when she died, and she had been sick for years, with conditions that would have forced most people out of active life far earlier. She continued traveling, founding, reforming, writing, and directing until the last weeks of her life, because the labor was not finished and she did not refuse it. That is not saintly abstraction. That is the documented behavioral pattern of a specific woman who was born in Avila in 1515, was told for 2 years that her most authentic experience was from the devil, survived that, rebuilt her interior life from the inside out, mapped the architecture of that rebuilding across 11 books and thousands of letters, built 17 convents with structural protections against the damage she had survived, and died on the road in 1582, still going toward the next work. John of the Cross understood the Dark Night because Teresa had already mapped a version of it in the interior castle. He is often cited as the great authority on the soul's dark passage. But the woman who invited him into the project had already been through the passage and was building the map while he was still in the monastery at Medina del Campo. She invited him into the Carmelite reform in 1568. He was 27 years her junior. She saw in him what she most valued, the willingness to say what was actually true, even when the institution preferred a more manageable version. That quality runs through every word Teresa ever wrote, from the Libro de la Vida to the interior castle. It is what makes her writing still land with the weight of direct testimony 5 centuries after her death. She is not describing what should happen in a soul. She is describing what happened in hers, including the parts that were done to her by people who should have known better, including the parts that left marks she carried until she died in Alba de Tormes in 1582. The small folded note in her cell, the single line from Job, "Lord, if I am still necessary to your people, I do not refuse the labor." She was not necessary because she was unmarked. She was necessary because she knew the terrain. The scar was the credential. The wound was the map. That is the last thing the betrayal gave her, and it was the thing she gave to everyone who came after.